Hey bub, the X-Men movie franchise is almost at an end. The recent release of Dark Phoenix means that there's only one movie left to see, Marvel's New Mutants. And given that there will be no familiar characters in that movie, it already feels like we've said goodbye to the saga. The franchise has seen 12 installments in 19 years to date, and that's included several jumps between eras and a soft reboot in the form of 2011's First Class. Rather predictably, the time jumps have resulted in a large number of contradictions and plot holes, and this video will take you through a whole bunch of them. As of 2011 and the aforementioned X-Men First Class, a new, younger cast of actors took on the roles of the titular mutants. That first movie with the new cast was set in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so why have the characters they play barely aged in X-Men Dark Phoenix? Dark Phoenix is set in the 1990s, meaning 30 years have passed since First Class, with Days of Future Past in the 70s and Apocalypse in the 80s in between. So what possible explanation is there for the likes of Professor X, Magneto, Mystique, and Beast barely aging a day? We know they have superpowers, but not aging isn't one of them. Having not aged for 3 decades, a bunch of X-Men movie characters aged massively in no time at all. You see, with X-Men Dark Phoenix being set in 1992 and X-Men being set in 2000, that's just an 8-year gap. Yet we're expected to believe that certain characters literally became different, much older people in that time. For example, Michael Fassbender's Magneto became Ian McKellen's Magneto. Also, in 2006's The Last Stand, we met Kelsey Grammer's Beast. Are we expected to believe he was Nicholas Hoult just 14 years earlier?
Dear Lord.
In X-Men Dark Phoenix, we saw Jean Grey possessed by the cosmic entity known as the Phoenix. It is, of course, an actual phoenix-shaped living being that comes from space and came into contact with Jean when the X-Men answered a distress signal from the Space Shuttle Endeavour. So it's pretty strange that her powers took the form of a phoenix a whole decade earlier in X-Men Apocalypse. Seriously, what was that all about? If Jean hadn't been imbued with the Phoenix's powers by that point, why did Phoenix-shaped psionic energy form around her in the movie's final battle? It's almost as if the writers had absolutely no idea what the franchise had in store just 3 years later. 2 different versions of the Juggernaut have appeared in the X-Men franchise, both of whom completely contradict the existence of the other. Real name Kane Marco, the first Juggernaut appeared in 2006's X-Men The Last Stand when he was portrayed by British ex-soccer player Vinnie Jones. Then in 2018's Deadpool 2, another version of the character appeared, also called Kane Marco. He was portrayed by David Leitch, although he was mostly CGI and voiced by Ryan Reynolds. But this guy was huge, a Hulk-sized giant. He was completely different to the first portrayal, to the extent that he couldn't possibly have been the same character. Juggernaut isn't the only super strong, super durable character who's appeared in 2 very different iterations in the X-Men movie universe. Colossus is another one. There have been 2 versions of the character that totally contradict the existence of the other, and the first one appeared in 2003's X2, 2006's X-Men The Last Stand, and 2014's X-Men Days of Future Past. He was called Peter Rasputin and was played by Daniel Cudmore. But then a version appeared in 2016's Deadpool and its 2018 sequel. He was called Peter Raspin, was completely CGI, and was voiced by Stefan Kapicic. And this version was older, more brutish, and, well, more Russian, as well as being permanently in his metallic form, unlike Cudmore's. He was essentially a different character entirely.
You got me in a box here.
Wade Wilson first appeared in 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was set in 1973, played by Ryan Reynolds, portrayed as a skilled mercenary who transformed into a multi-powered killer with a sewn-up mouth. His powers included super speed, optic blasts, teleportation, control over machinery, retractable adamantium blades, and healing. He was awful. But in 2016, Wade Wilson reappeared in Deadpool, also played by Ryan Reynolds, as a skilled and mouthy mercenary given healing abilities at the cost of major full-body deformity.
Yeah.
Basically, it was the same character more than 40 years apart with very different paths. Another character who has appeared twice looking completely different is Toad. Ray Park first played the grotesque bird-eating character in 2000's X-Men when he looked like a relatively normal human. You know, apart from the green skin and ridiculously long tongue, he was part of Magneto's Brotherhood of Mutants. But then, the character reappeared in 2014's Days of Future Past, which was set in the 1970s, played by Evan John Keat. This version of the character was younger, but obviously not a younger version of Park's portrayal, as he had mottled skin which was otherwise white in color and was generally quite blatantly a very different individual. Given that Hugh Jackman portrayed Wolverine from 2000 onwards, and given that he did so for 17 years, the fact that the X-Men franchise did a lot of time hopping was always going to be problematic. Wolverine has a regenerative healing factor, a byproduct of which is that he's supposed to stop aging. Yet not only did he quite obviously age over those 17 years, he also looked older in the past than he did in the future. Jackman was only 31 when X-Men was released in 2000, which is when it was set, but in the varying movies in which we saw him in the past, Jackman was much older. It really made no sense. In 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand, humans used the mutant known as Leech to develop what they described as a cure for the mutant gene. While lots of mutants saw that as an insult and then used it as an excuse to declare war on humanity, others were quite pleasantly surprised by it. One of those mutants, initially at least, was Hank McCoy, aka Beast, played by Kelsey Grammer, as it allowed him to look normal. Yet, in X-Men First Class, 4 decades earlier, Nicholas Holt's Beast had already crafted a cure himself, which he went on to perfect in Days of Future Past. In 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand, Professor Xavier was killed when the first Phoenix version of Jean Grey completely obliterated his body. The movie's post-credits scene revealed him to be kind of alive when he communicated with Moira MacTaggert via a hospital patient. But it was still very confusing when he reappeared with his own body fully intact in the post-credits scene of 2013's The Wolverine. How did that happen? He subsequently appeared in 2014's Days of Future Past and 2017's Logan, again, with no explanation given as to how he was back in his original crippled body. It wouldn't seem quite so odd if his death in The Last Stand wasn't so bold, so shocking, so tragic, and so meaningful. We mourned, for goodness sake. Back to pairs of characters whose very existence contradict each other now, and this time it's Angel, or Archangel if you prefer. His real name is Warren Worthington III, and we first saw him in 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand, yet he then reappeared as a teenager in 2016's X-Men Apocalypse, which was set some 30 years before The Last Stand, played by Ben Hardy. Both iterations had wings, but the Apocalypse version embraced it more, and he was chosen by the titular villain to be one of his 4 horsemen. The versions weren't actually all that different, but the fact they existed in different decades was a definite timeline breaker. The next example is Emma Frost, the telepathic mutant who can also change her body into a highly durable diamond form. Frost first appeared in 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine when she was played by Tahina Tazi. The character wasn't named in the movie, but given her powers, we all assumed it was her, and the end credits confirmed as much. Then in 2011's X-Men First Class, January Jones, who is 10 years older than Tazi, portrayed an older Emma Frost in a time period that took place about a decade before Origins did. One of the more extreme examples of character contradictions in the X-Men movie universe is Bolivar Trask. He first appeared as a politician in 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand, played by Bill Duke, a black actor who stands at around 6 foot 3 inches tall. But in 2014's Days of Future Past, which was set in the 1970s, he's a military scientist whose company, Trask Industries, created the Sentinels, and he's played by Peter Dinklage, a white actor who stands at around 4 feet 3 inches tall. The height and the race of the character is obviously irrelevant, but the fact is, the two are very, very different in terms of their appearance, as well as their jobs and the eras in which they lived. Yet they're the same person? How does that work?
There has to be some kind of mistake.
Moira MacTaggert is yet another example of a character who's appeared in 2 different iterations in truly inexplicable fashion in the X-Men movies. She first appeared in 2006's X-Men: The Last Stand in a minor role played by Olivia Williams, but Rose Byrne also played the character, starting in 2011 in a much more prominent role in X-Men First Class, then again in 2016's X-Men Apocalypse. Those movies were set 20 years apart, around 40 and 50 years before The Last Stand, yet MacTaggert is a similar age in all three. In reality, she should have been in her 80s by the time The Last Stand came around, but as we've established, logic seems to go out of the window in this franchise. X-Men The Last Stand showed us younger Professor X and Magneto visiting a young Jean Grey a couple of decades prior in the hope of recruiting her to Xavier's school. But in X-Men First Class, in the 1960s, the pair's relationship was destroyed when Magneto inadvertently caused Xavier's paralysis. So that can't have happened in the revised timeline, yet Jean is already at the school next time we see her as a youngster in X-Men Apocalypse, so who recruited her? There's absolutely no explanation given as far as who brought her there to begin with is concerned, and given that it took two wise men to convince her to do so originally, that's kind of an important and timeline-wrecking omission. In X-Men First Class, we were shown that Charles Xavier and Mystique were childhood best friends. In fact, they were essentially adopted brother and sister. And yet, in the future, as depicted in the original series such as X-Men X2 and X-Men The Last Stand, the two characters never so much as look in each other's general direction, let alone acknowledge or reference their relationship they had in the past.
You're being ridiculous.
It really is as if it never happened, which is very strange given what a huge part of the prequel movie's stories it was. In X-Men The Last Stand, two prominent characters who were injected with the mutant cure were Rogue and Magneto, which rendered two of the most powerful characters among the cast completely powerless. And yet, without any explanation, all of the character development associated with that powerlessness was taken away and retconned by the time X-Men Days of Future Past came around 8 years later. Magneto has all of his powers back in the theatrical release, and although Rogue doesn't appear in that version of the movie due to her subplot getting completely cut out, the Rogue cut depicts her as having her powers back too. So how did that happen? There was quite literally no explanation given whatsoever. Professor Xavier's mobility has been inconsistent in the X-Men movies. In X-Men First Class, set in the 1960s, a stray bullet ended up in his spine, leaving him paralyzed. And while we briefly see him walking around again in the next movie, Days of Future Past, which is set in the 70s, that was thanks to Hank McCoy's mutant cure. For the rest of the prequel series, Xavier is in a wheelchair. However, in X-Men The Last Stand, when a much older Xavier and Magneto visit a young Jean Grey with hopes of taking her to Xavier's school, he's standing on 2 feet again. How is that possible? And what happens between them and the first X-Men movie that puts him back in a wheelchair? At the end of the Wolverine's iconic adamantium claws get sliced off by the Silver Samurai, supposedly permanently. It was a powerful moment, given that they're Wolvie's trademark. But while the adamantium was gone, he at least grew his bone claws back. But hold on a second. By the time the next movie came around, X-Men Days of Future Past a year later, he had the adamantium claws back, as if the events of the Wolverine never took place. And in true X-Men movie fashion, there was absolutely no explanation or mention about how this had happened. He would have had to gone through an entirely new Weapon X procedure to get the adamantium in his claws back, but William Stryker had been dead for years by then. Cerebro is important in the X-Men movies, so it would certainly be helpful if fans knew who built it, right? Well, that's a shame, because that's totally unclear as well. The original X-Men trilogy tells us that both Professor X and Magneto created the powerful device back when they were buddies. However, in X-Men First Class, it was revealed that neither of them had anything to do with its creation. Hank McCoy, aka Beast, had built it alone at the CIA's headquarters. Sure, Xavier might have made some changes to Cerebro after that had happened, but the fact is, we've now been told that Beast invented it and Magneto had absolutely nothing at all to do with it. In X-Men Days of Future Past, the twist ending revealed that when Wolverine fell into the treacherous hands of Major William Stryker, Stryker was actually Mystique in disguise. It left fans wondering what happened to the Stryker that Mystique replaced, and whether or not Mystique would still ensure Wolverine became an experiment for the Weapon X program, or if she delivered him to the X-Men earlier than was originally intended. But all of this theorizing was in vain, because in the very next film, X-Men Apocalypse, Stryker was back to being just Stryker, as if nothing had happened. Oh, and Wolverine was a Weapon X test subject, as he was always destined to be. It makes you wonder why the twist ending occurred in the first place. Sabretooth first appeared in 2000's X-Men when he was portrayed by former professional wrestler Tyler Mane. He was a very animalistic looking character whose only vocalizations came in the form of growls and roars. But then the character appeared in 2009's X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was set in the 1970s, in which he was more human-looking and could speak. A completely different character, essentially, and played by Liv Schreiber. Are we expected to believe he devolved into a talking human to a growling animal? That's an absolutely ridiculous notion. Sticking with Sabretooth, the events of X-Men Origins Wolverine completely contradicted what we'd already seen in X-Men 9 years earlier. Origins revealed that Wolverine and Sabretooth were in fact half-brothers, and that they'd grown up together, fought in several wars together, joined the superpowered mutant Team X together, and had a big falling out. But they didn't even acknowledge each other's existence in X-Men, which was just set a couple of decades later. Granted, Sabretooth's appearance had changed and Wolverine's memories had been tampered with, but what was Sabretooth's excuse? Surely someone, Professor X for instance, should have known that there was a link between the pair. In hindsight, it seems very silly to have just not acknowledged it at all. As if we didn't already know how broken it was, the ultimate break in the X-Men timeline came in this year's Dark Phoenix, when Jean Grey died and Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters was renamed the Jean Grey School for Gifted Youngsters. That movie was set in the 1990s, yet from 2000's X-Men movie and onwards, it's always been known as Xavier's School. But what makes it even more weird is that Jean Grey seemingly died in 2003's X2, and they didn't rename the school after her then, even though they'd known her for more than a decade longer at that point. Of course, she was revealed to be alive 3 years later in The Last Stand, so it was just as well, really. Dark Phoenix also revealed that aliens exist in Fox's X-Men movie universe, as the manipulative shape-shifting extraterrestrial race known as the Dabari were a major part of the plot. They, in particular their supreme leader Vuk, wanted to drain Jean Grey of the Phoenix to utilize its power for themselves in order to destroy Earth and rebuild it as a home for their race. But they ultimately failed and Jean died, saving her friends from them. But if aliens revealed themselves in 1992, why didn't we so much as hear them referenced in the movie set in the future? Surely they'd at least be spoken about, or perhaps the X-Men would have a faction devoted to protecting against otherworldly threats. Oh well, you know, they must have just forgotten.
You read these in your spare time?
So that was all a bit of a mess, right? Did you enjoy this video? Can you think of any other ways the X-Men franchise destroyed its own timeline? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Screen Rant for more great videos like this one. See you later, bub.